but thank you so much for joining us all tonight. You'll have seen from the holding slide that, you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. So you have your privacy. If you need to pop off for a minute, make a cup of tea, whatever you need to do. You can pose any of your questions through the Q&A function as we go along. We have a few topics that we're looking to discuss ourselves, but if you have anything extra to say, please do let us know. If the panel could please introduce themselves as well, please, starting with Francis.
Hi, so I'm Frances Klemperer. I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and I've worked in Kensington, South Ken and Westminster, the NHS for more years than I care to remember, maybe about 30 years. So thank you for inviting me along.
You're welcome. Jane?
Yes, I'm Jane Ogden. I'm a professor in health psychology at the University of Surrey. I'm an academic psychologist, so I do research and I teach. Most of my research is on eating behaviour and weight management, obesity, looking at really around food choices and the causes of undereating and overeating.
Excellent. And I'm Chris. I'm the head of healthcare for Heart UK, which is a specialist cholesterol charity, as you'll all know. And I am a registered nurse by background. It's worth saying that we don't have a dietitian on this webinar, but you can pose questions to our dietitians. If you want to email ask, that's ask at heartuk.org.uk, we can address your dietary queries. But for the sake of tonight, just to understand, you have a nurse and 2 psychiatric professionals. So anything too dietary, we can't address. So if we start off, we have to put this in terms of the current pandemic, obviously, to start with. That eating behaviours are interesting in a general sense, but when such a global shift occurs, such as a pandemic, it does have an impact on everybody. I think it's fair to say that most people are struggling in some way. People are seeing a shift in not just their eating habits, but their mental health. And we know those things are quite closely linked anyway. So in terms of the pandemic, Francis, I know we talked the other day about, how have we been affected? What are the psychological effects in terms of the current pandemic?
Well, I read a phrase that I thought captured it beautifully, which was loss, isolation, and trauma. I thought those 3 words really struck home to me. Loss, of course, we've all been reading about people losing jobs, no money, and of course, loss of opportunity as well, particularly for our young people just graduating, or people who have lost their job and see no prospect. And then also, of course, loss of loved ones, which we're also very conscious of. So that's a loss element. Isolation, loneliness has been a terrible burden for very many people. But it's not just loneliness, it's also the entrapment, I think, is a great word. Many of us have felt, and many of us have spoken about, feeling like we're in prison, stuck indoors, not able to follow our usual routine, not able to do our usual activities we enjoy, cut off from the things that we love, bored, restless, and not sleeping well. And overshadowing all of that, there's this sort of fear of this infection and what that could mean. So that's the sort of the loss, the isolation. And then trauma is again, we're reading about this all the time. What is it like when you have coronavirus? It could be a very mild infection, or it could mean being in ITU for a very long time, sedated on a ventilator, and the psychological consequences of going through all of that. And then, of course, it's not over when you come out. We're beginning to see and understand increasingly the potential long-term effects of ongoing physical symptoms and a lot of fatigue as well that people have suffered from, with all the psychological consequences of those as well.
It's a traumatizing experience to be in hospital as it is under the current pandemic situation, even more so. We know that people who, for example, end up in intensive care can have issues with mental health in both the short and long term because of the effects that can have on the body. So we should never really forget the mental health implications of physical problems, because they're tied so closely together. I know we talked really briefly about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, about after being in ITU. Do you think you could expand on that a little bit as well? Because I think we've had some questions come through as well about those types of conditions.
Yes, well, we recognise that it is quite common for people to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder after they have been in ITU, and quite often with coronavirus there can be a period of delirium where people are extremely confused and distressed and scared as well, even before they go through this experience of being placed on a ventilator and losing complete blocks of time. And indeed on the news, just yesterday, I think I heard it was a call from University College London from a group of psychologists and psychiatrists saying we should be following people up for at least a year after they've left ITU, because we need to identify people. We need to spot the PTSD. We need to provide help where people are suffering from these symptoms.
Difficult to diagnose at the best of times, but it's good to know where there are opportunities for us to follow people up. We should be focusing on those. So people who've been in intensive care do continually report back and say that it's affected them in very, very different ways, and it's hard to put your finger on it. We see this as well in people, for example, who've had cardiac arrests. So there is a huge lack of support in the UK and globally for people who've had a cardiac arrest and then been brought back, and how they've been affected too. So there are instances where we can look at how mental health is impacted by, again, physical conditions and what we can do to solve those. We're obviously covering here not just coronavirus, but sort of general patterns as well. So I think if we start with the general factors, Jane, that influence eating behaviour, and then if we come back to how we've been affected recently with Francis, I think that might be a good way to kind of structure it. What do you think?
Okay. So, I mean, maybe I can start with that. So I suppose in terms of understanding eating behaviour, there's literature out there which focuses on more kind of biological models of eating behaviour and the role of physical hunger, brain chemicals, stomach chemicals and stomach capacity, and the notion that kind of hunger and eating behaviour is a biological or evolutionary process. And I suppose that my take on it is that there's so much evidence that eating behaviour is related to lots of psychological factors, and that hunger itself is a percept or a perception, as opposed to a physical sensation, which is related to our how much we pay attention to it and our appraisal mechanisms. And so we then make sense of what's going on in our body in a psychological way, which then determines how hungry we feel and then how much we eat afterwards. And I suppose the way I frame it is that we eat for kind of three reasons, really, above and beyond the biology of food. But we eat for emotional regulation, and that we learn from childhoods that food is a way to manage the emotions that we have. We eat through social interaction, because food is part of the mechanisms of engaging with other people in a social way. And we eat because of the environment that we're in. So the environment presents us with food triggers, and then we eat as a reaction to those food triggers. And that all comes from our childhoods and the learning and the culture that we're in, where food is used as a reward when we're a child, and we're rewarded with food for, behaving or for doing our homework, or, in a kind of bribery type way. And it comes from the language around food, when food is seen as being a treat, or seen as being special, or seen as being a reward, or seen as being naughty, or seen as being forbidden. And then just the ways that our environments have changed over the last few decades. So there's much more food in our environment, but also food is increasingly linked to lots of behaviours and activities. So watching a film now has popcorn associated with it, having a coffee now has cake associated with it. So food is kind of sprinkled out, if you like, into all corners of our lives, rather than just being to do with meal times. Yeah. And that's my kind of psychological framing, really, of why we eat.
That's framed very well, actually, and I like the way that it does touch on very much what we're going through at the moment, in that you talk about social eating. And that's been impacted, obviously, because we're not really socialising like we normally would, going out for meals at restaurants and cafes and things. But yeah, our diets are probably worse than ever. But that's also to do with what Francis said about, you know, isolation. How we behave in isolation is very different to how we behave out in the world, and how that impacts on our diet is very interesting. At the moment, there are lots of trends in, especially things like weight gain. For a lot of people who are perhaps, like you said, they're eating for emotional reasons rather than just simply because they're hungry. Eating because we're bored. I think we're all bored in some way, whether you're on furlough, whether you're retired, or whether you're still working from home. I think everybody's experiencing periods of enormous boredom, and nothing fills boredom like a Kit Kat, which obviously we're getting a lot of weight gain, so we can see, you know, you have your nice drink and your cake, you have your fatty food, and it just makes you feel a bit better. And I think that is happening a lot more than people maybe want to admit to, because there is a kind of, I would say, a sort of shame associated with overeating a lot of the time that people don't always want to share, and that can have its own impacts. But as far as, you know, how diets have been affected during lockdown, Francis, we talked about weight gain and actually weight loss in those two different categories. Could you just go over that with us for kind of...
Well, it's exactly as you said, all this boredom, loss of routine, and of course disturbed sleep. People are tired, people aren't active, they're not maintaining good sleep habits, and so that makes people eat more. And then of course boredom is a great reason to drink more. So we know from surveys that perhaps a quarter to a third of people say they are also drinking more. And we remember also those photos at the beginning of lockdown with those empty supermarket shelves, and one of the areas was the alcohol shelves. It wasn't just the flour and eggs that was missing. So yes, boredom, snacking, and compensating for the absence of other interesting things, and absence of other coping mechanisms as well. You know, when we feel a bit low, a bit anxious in usual life, there are other things we can do. We can go out and see people, or we can go to a film, or we can occupy ourselves. Whereas now, you know, it's sort of us and our fridge, and no daily commute, no going out to see friends, that is helping us get that exercise instead. So you also mentioned weight loss. Of course, that's the other side of the coin with COVID-19, that a lot of people who've got ill have lost a lot of weight. Diarrhea is not an uncommon symptom, or just as one of the symptoms, but generally weight loss is a problem, and people coming out the other side often have a lot of weight that they need to gain, and can be terribly fatigued, such as just eating. It can be a huge effort. And of course, there's also the preparing food and the getting the food from the shops, all those sorts of things, particularly if you're on your own, it can be a real struggle.
It's that we talked as well about, was it a loss of smell or taste that we're starting to see as well, that's associated with sort of post-coronavirus. Some people are having those kind of senses affected, and obviously if you have a reduced sense of taste or smell, you're going to seek out things that are maybe stronger, whether that's because they have more salt or more fats or anything that's going to make it more pleasing. I think we see, and then there's the whole issue that we know is ongoing of people who've lost weight and want to put weight back on, but they're finding a healthy way to gain weight, because traditionally in our heads we think, if I have to gain weight, I have to eat more and more rubbish, and that's not necessarily true. There are healthy ways for us to gain weight, but it's not spoken about as much. So I think there's a gap here for people who've had coronavirus, or in general people who've lost weight who want to gain it again and do that in a healthy way. Lockdown in general, it has affected our food intake, it has affected our body weight and health, and I think Jane had some really interesting comments on this as well, about the current situation and the difficulties, that have been posed.
Well, I suppose if you look at that framing that I gave earlier as to why we eat, all of those mechanisms have just changed. So if we eat for emotional regulation, then suddenly we're in a world with a completely different set of coping mechanisms, like Francis just said. And so we have to find other ways of managing our emotions. So we may have chatted to our friends, we may have socialized, we may have gone out, we may have, just gone to work or had a change of environment, and we can't do any of that now. So what we have is food, and food becomes an easy go-to way of managing your emotions. But also just our physical environments. If you think of how much we eat in response to those triggers, we have no sort of spatial separation between where we're sleeping, where we're working, where we're living, and where we're eating. We might be moving from room to room, but actually the fridge is in the proximity of all of those spaces. So whereas we may well have left the house to go to work and then have an office, which is actually separate to the food space, those spaces have become intertwined. So it makes it so much easier just to react in a mindless way, if you like, to those physical triggers to eat. And then I think, what tends to happen is because the sense of fullness isn't just driven by a kind of biological mechanism, we then sort of ignore or forget the food that we have been eating. So it's not as if we re-regulate ourselves and we count the snacks that we've been having and therefore we don't have lunch, or we count the snacks and therefore we don't have dinner. Those kind of snacks are almost, they're ignored, and evidence shows that we don't process food in the same way. That doesn't have a label of, a meal, because it's not remembered. It's just mindlessly eaten. It doesn't fill us up in the same way, and therefore we don't process it, therefore we don't think we've had it. And so we carry on eating more. So those lack of social spaces means that we are using food in a way which then we carry on using it even more, because we're eating as we used to do, as well as eating as we are now anyway. So we're bound inevitably really to eat more now than we would have done before.
Yeah, that loss of routine and boundaries is so important. And again, as Francis said, the loss of distraction. Whereas normally you wake up at a specific time to get your train to work or your drive to work, you arrive, you have a set routine, you have your tea, you have your lunch, and then you go home in the evening for your dinner. And we've lost that. We've lost of our structure for the most part. And we're now being left to sort of almost run riot with our diets and sleeping plans, because there's no structure in place. And that obviously has had a huge impact on how we look at things. I think that it's interesting to see where snacking has always been a factor in a lot of people's weight gain. It's not just what you have for your meals, it's what you have in between. And if we're doing a lot of snacking, which I'm sure a lot of people are, that's going to be something that we're going to need to look at post-lockdown to actually break those habits again, because it's as difficult as it is to transition to a situation like this, it's going to be equally difficult to transition back again. And as we said earlier, the mental health implications of the current situation, how is that going to hold us back from getting back to normal? Are people going to be more anxious about returning to their workplaces and anxious about being back in public? Is it going to trigger underlying conditions people already have issues with their mental health? It's kind of a minefield, and it's not something that we are really all that used to, because we've not really, in living memory, as far as I'm aware, we've not had a situation like this. And while science and things like that have moved on, we haven't looked at these types of things in relation to a pandemic because it's been so long. So it will be very interesting to follow those trends as we go through. Looking at sort of we've raised a lot of problems, but looking at the solutions that sit behind those as well. Do we have some possible solutions to stay well in lockdown that you guys could share with us, that hopefully will support us in coming out the other side and being as healthy as possible?
Well, I suppose I can start with that, if you like, from a kind of probably from a fairly personal perspective really, but I think some of the tricks to being in lockdown are just to try and recreate some of the structures that we had before in our previous lives, which were there for a reason really. So it is about trying to go to bed at the same time every night and getting up at the same time in the morning, and it is about still trying to have the rigidity of meals rather than snacking. And in terms of food, I am a big believer in pinning foods to kind of time and place, and that that there is a space which is called an eating space, and that's your table. And it might be your desk, your workspace as well, but somehow that has to also be your eating space, so that you don't eat at other places and you try and pin food to certain times and spaces. And then also just activity. You know, we are allowed out of the house. And I think my experience has been that people do seem to be getting outdoors more often, and enjoying nature perhaps more than they used to be, and being aware of nature a bit more, because that's what's been left to us as a way of looking after our own well-being. And so absolutely maximising the use of being able to get out of the building into nature if you can, and appreciating all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is that structure. It's difficult to implement a structure almost on yourself. It's you know, we do rely on external factors a lot to influence the structure in our lives, whether that be because you have a duty to perform, whether you're a carer, or whether you have to work, or whatever it is, you have responsibilities, and they help us to find those things. And then there's, like you said, about space. So for the same reason my mum always used to say, you don't watch TV in bed because you won't be able to sleep. Having those separate areas where you say, this is where I do this, this is where I do that, will actually help us to focus better. And I think I've found that myself, actually. I found that I can work at my desk at home, but if I try and sit on my sofa and work, it doesn't really happen, because I try to define my sofa as somewhere where I would read, or I would watch TV, or catch up with somebody. And having those boundaries has actually been quite helpful. And I think if you're lucky enough to be able to do that as well, and, you know, take advantage of.
And I suppose the other thing that I think is also really important is just being kind to yourself, really, and just letting yourself off the hook in lots of ways. You know, we have such high expectations about, you know, working hard and being productive and being a good person, and looking all these things that we do in normal life, and it has all been shot a bit at the moment. And somehow that's fine as well, just to accept that we aren't going to be as good in lots of different domains of our life, and being kind to ourselves. And we are in the middle of a pandemic, so what better way of, you know, letting yourself off the hook in a way than that? It's never happened before, and it might never happen again. So,
Yeah.
Just being kind to yourself, and perhaps lowering your standards. You know, I mean, I know my children are pretty much grown up now, but plenty of people I know with small children have been really struggling with homeschooling and juggling work-life balance. And that's about being kind to yourself and realising you can't do everything, and you can't be the best mum and the best teacher and the best everything at this time. You've just got to be good enough, really.
And I like to that. I think we think a lot about trying to retain a sense of purpose, whether that's in a sort of very small way. Small projects are good because they keep you focused on here and now, doing something purposeful, and getting a sense of control, because I think something we're very conscious of is part of the fear and the anxiety is this sense of not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing what the world's going to be like. A lot of anxiety around, of course. So focusing on now trying to have things that immerse you. I mean, I absolutely agree. Nature is wonderful in that way. Exercise and nature combined both allow you to be immersed. Do something now. Think about where you are now, it's not. I think this is tendency to get lost. I mean, in the whole pandemic, actually, there's been a lot said about how people that have been listening to the news all the time, and it's very important, therefore, to just listen, say, once a day, catch up once a day, and allow the rest of life to carry on in a way that feels meaningful, even if it's rather different to normal life.
I think that's an important point as well, is we're seeing a lot more, forgive the term, obsessive behaviours. So it's things like people can become very, very ingrained with updating themselves several times a day on what's happening with the pandemic, what's going on, what's the news reports, what's happening. And actually that's very stressful, because we're only living through the pandemic if we're also reading about it constantly and dipping in and out of the news. Especially, you know, we all have apps on our phones, we all follow the news all the time for the most part, and being kind of stricter with yourself and saying, okay, once, maybe twice a day, I will check to see what's going on. I'll check for a government update or something like that. But actually going on to a news bulletin several times a day is probably going to drive you're feeling low or feeling anxious, because there are very, very few positive stories at the moment. There's very little that comes through that isn't kind of quite inflammatory or quite stressful. And it's very difficult. I think we are curious as a species. We always want to know more about the situation we're in, but balancing that against our mental health and well-being is just as important. So I think, yeah, like I said, I definitely understand where people come from with that one. So I was going to say, despite the fact that we've done quite a lot of these webinars, I forgot to do something right at the beginning, and I do apologise. I would like to launch a poll and just pretend that Jane and Francis have not answered any of my questions so far. If we could just have a look at what people's level of knowledge was before the webinar about the relationship between psychology and diet. It's a very, very interesting area. It's something that I've been interested in for a long time. But even I would say my level of knowledge has not been fantastic. So it's great to be able to speak to Jane and Francis about this. Lots of you voting, thank you very much. There's quite a few people, admittedly, not knowledgeable at all, not knowledgeable, not sure. I think that's pretty much where most of us have sat. I'll just give a few seconds for the rest of the votes to come in. Thank you so much, guys. So we've got more than half of people were either not sure, not knowledgeable, or not knowledgeable at all. So hopefully when I do this poll at the end of the webinar, we will see an improvement for the most part. So thank you very much, everyone who's voted there. And just to acknowledge as well that we have got your questions coming through. We're going to start to look at those very shortly. What I did want to do though as well is have a quick chat with Jane, who has done quite a bit of, quite a few studies around psychology and diet and why we eat and what the things are that influence us. I thought a quick overview of some of her studies and research would be quite interesting for people. I remember being at a conference when I very, very first met Jane. And I think I came across quite frantic, but I said, I have to have your slides. You have to send them to me, because the way that it is translated into the way people understand I think is the most important thing about research. It's so badly interpreted and misunderstood. And I think the way that Jane presents things actually is incredibly clear. So I would love to get an overview of those studies, Jane.
Oh, wow, all of them. You want to prompt me, or shall I start? I mean, I suppose if I were to sum up, I suppose lots of things that I do. I quite like to do two things really with eating behaviour. I quite like to do qualitative stuff where I delve into depth and find out how people feel about food and their relationships with food, and the meaning of food in their lives. And from that more exploratory qualitative research, I guess, what I've focused on is the function that food plays in people's lives, which is so above and beyond just hunger. So very much to do with relationships and love and management of their emotions and the way they situate themselves with each other, but also very much around identity really, and food as a communication. And I think food is a language, I suppose. I see food and statements about self as being a kind of language that we use to communicate with each other. So I am the kind of person who eats a lot, doesn't eat a lot, is picky, will eat anything, loves trying food, is very rigid with food. They are statements that we make about ourselves, and I think food becomes a part of our identity really, and it's a way that we tell the world about who we are. And one of the things I get my students to do towards the end of a lecture is I always say, I want you to imagine that you fancy somebody and that you're inviting them around for dinner and you're going to cook for them. And I want you to imagine what you would cook and why, and what that says about you. And is that a food from your childhood, or is it something, you wouldn't choose roast dinner necessarily because that's perhaps a bit motherly or a bit mumsy, but you wouldn't choose oysters because that's like a bit desperate. Or you wouldn't choose beans on toast because that makes you look a bit like you're a bit useless. So, all food has meaning behind it. And so you then think about, what am I saying by that food, and who is that I'm trying to present myself as? you know, I'm exotic, or I'm experimental, or I'm, you know, reliable or something. So food has meaning, and I guess I'm interested in that. And then
I love that. I think I just to touch on that point, actually, I think that that's something that you've said before that really hit me in a certain way at one of your lectures. And I remember saying to the person next to me, I was like, oh God, food is actually love in a lot of ways for a lot of people. And it's kind of like, sometimes it's the dishes that are handed down through families and various cultures. Like my nonna is from Italy, and she is the most wonderful cook, and making meals that she makes for me makes me incredibly happy and very fulfilled. And if I'm going to make dinner for somebody that I care about, they're most likely to get one of my nonna's recipes, because that's a way of me saying, you know, I love you, I care for you, I've made this food for you, you know, this is something that's been handed down, it actually does mean something. So I like that side of thinking beyond, you know, we eat because we have to eat to live, to how over time have we evolved to kind of say food is an expression of something. I think it's...
And then the other side of that dynamic is that you can imagine, you know, once you've done your communication to someone and you said, I prepared you this food because it's a sign of love, and they go, oh, I don't like that. That's so powerful. You know, that tiny little interaction between people, whether it's between a mother and a child, or a child and a grandmother, or whether it's between a couple that quite fancy each other. You know, you put effort into something and then they leave it, or they don't eat it, or they say it's horrible, or that's incredibly powerful. So as children, we learn that very quickly as well, that when our mother usually puts the food on the table, it's so easy to wind them up by going, don't like pasta, don't like pesto, don't like vegetables. And so I always think that's really important to remember as well, is that when people express dislike for food, it's often not the food that they dislike, it's the reaction to that statement of dislike, which is so incredibly powerful. And that's where food can become problematic in dynamics, because, you know, it creates such a powerful reaction in people. And that can lead to picky eating in children, or it can lead to eating disorders in teenagers, because it gets the reaction to the people around them. So I guess that's one bit of my research. And then the other bit has been looking at doing experimental studies. And I quite like doing experimental studies in the lab or in the real world, but looking at, you know, what factors make us eat more or make us eat less, really. So, I mean, little studies that I've done, I've often done these with my students, but we've done studies where food is called a snack or a meal, and it's the same food. It's just a pot of pasta from a supermarket with exactly the same number of calories in it. But if you call it a snack, then people eat more afterwards. Whereas if you call it a meal, they eat less afterwards, just because that's what it's being called. If you eat it standing up with a plastic fork, then they eat more afterwards. If you eat it sitting down on a ceramic plate and a metal knife and fork, then they eat less afterwards, because it's conceptualized as a meal. So, you know, I quite like things like that. If you eat a cereal bar walking around the corridors, then afterwards you eat more than if you've sat it down, because when you're walking around, you're not thinking about it. So that kind of makes a difference as well. Or we did another study where we had people eating in a driving simulator at work. We have a kind of half a car. And if you eat in a driving simulator, well, you eat the most. We did them when they're eating in front of the TV as well, but they eat more in front of the TV. But when you're driving and eating, the food going into your body doesn't correlate with how full you then feel. So it's as if the calories are going in, but the body's not filling up, because you're thinking about doing something else. So the more distracted you are, you can eat more because it's going in, but strangely your body's then not going, oh, I've eaten lots and therefore I'm full. So again, it's all about hunger as a perception, really, and that it can't be calories in. It's not a biological process of how many calories have I consumed. It's what was I calling those calories when they were going in? Was I calling them a meal or a snack, or was I even aware that they were going in, or was I actually calling it, I'm watching the telly, so therefore it's going into my body.
The labels we attach to things, that's interesting as to whether is it a snack, is it a meal? And also I think looking at when you go to the supermarket and you grab something, if it's labelled as a snack, you'll just treat it as one. but actually that could have the same number of calories as a meal that you would normally have, but because you've had it classified to you as a snack, just eat it and you move on and you eat something else. I think that's it's very, very easy to do. Very easy to do. There's lots of nodding and smiling from Francis and I, so it's incredibly interesting to hear all of that, because I think sometimes it's when someone in an expert area says it out loud, you think it makes perfect sense. You know, all those things that sit in the back of your head as to why you might do certain things a certain way. We all like to feel quite unique, but essentially we're all influenced by similar things, and that notion, I think, has a great sense of togetherness about it. Like, especially during coronavirus, you're not in it on your own, we're all in it together. We all feel a bit rubbish, a bit bored, and it's easy to think you're the only one going through it.
Can I just add something, Chris? I mean, you mentioned this problem of losing a sense of smell that many people have experienced with COVID-19, and not everybody is recovering their sense of smell. I was very surprised to learn, and you can both comment on this for me, that some people, I mean, you pointed out some people will then eat, add more, particularly more salt, it seems, to try and get some flavour to their food, because they may have taste, but they don't have smell anymore, and they therefore don't have flavour. But I was also reading that quite often when people have lost a sense of smell, they no longer feel hungry. And I think Jane might have something to say about that, because they're not smelling the food, and that all that aroma, that wonderful smell of food that we all love and makes us salivate, when that is missing, when the sense of smell is missing, the salivation is missing. And I was very curious to learn the sense of hunger sometimes is not there at all. And so people actually can suffer from malnutrition if they've lost their sense of smell. But that whole context thing that Jane has been talking about, I mean, I think that could be another problem that we will see more of, as we are expecting there to be more people who have not recovered their sense of smell, despite having got through the illness itself. I think that's something you've looked into, Jane, at all.
I don't know about the data from coronavirus, but I think my understanding of the literature for both taste and smell is that the world is slightly split, in that some people, it's a bit like the stress literature. So people under stress either overeat or undereat. We seem to go one way or the other. And I think my understanding of the literature on taste and smell is that when you've lost your sense of taste and smell, some people eat more because they're still eating from the habit of when they ate, but they're chasing the sense association that they're expecting to have from the food, and because they're getting some sensation, but they're trying to get enough to get to satiety. That's right. So they keep going and they keep going, and therefore they can actually eat more. But I guess also, if you're eating for taste or for smell or for the pleasure of it, and you're not getting it, that might then become aversive. But I'm not sure what's happening with people post-coronavirus, whether we're going to have that kind of bipolar distribution or not, really. It'd be interesting to see. Yes. But I think the fatigue...
We've had quite a few comments and stuff come through about all this. It's so interesting to talk about it. There's lots of different factors that people are actually flagging on the Q&A, which are interesting as to, you know, how they've been impacted. There was somebody who said that... are people going to be less likely to pick up food on the run because of the risk of contamination? So when we go into the supermarket with that purpose of, I am going to go in, I'm going to buy X, Y, and Z. I don't want to touch anything, smell anything, or come into contact with somebody, and I want to exit as soon as possible. And how that's affected our snacking. I think I'm less likely to browse the shelves now than I would be before and peruse the aisles because I just want to get out. I think that's quite an interesting thing, how we've been influenced at the moment to understand that apparently everything now that people touch is a risk. So we have to touch as few things as possible when we're out in public. I find that really interesting.
I guess I was just going to say my concern about that is that because we're not going to be grabbing things on the go, which is probably good for us, we're actually buying more snacks on our weekly trip to the same supermarket and bringing them home. And then once they're in our home, then they're going to get eaten, aren't they? Whereas, you know, I would have said in the past, if you don't want to eat it, don't buy it. You know, that seems to me the simplest trick, really. But at the moment, you know, we're definitely doing a 1 weekly shop and we're buying everything, so we don't have to go back again. And I definitely know, this is totally anecdotal, but people who are buying more snacks in supermarkets than they've ever bought, and then they're in the home and there they are there. So it's tricky.
Yeah. We've also had, in relation to sort of food and mental health, we've sort of had a question about what foods have a positive effect on mental health. What we tend to do, and I know that there might be a different psychiatric opinion of this. I'm going to dive in as a nurse and sort of say that the people who tend to report to us anyway as a health charity that have the best sort of mental health when it comes to their diet are people who have particularly addressed any issues that they've had with food. If they've recognized they have a problem, they go through therapy, whether that be cognitive behavior therapy or counseling, to change their diets and do different things, whether that's with medications or just with some support through therapy is very effective. But also people who generally follow a healthy diet, and that does sound boring, however, it's the typical message of, you know, get your 5 a day, don't eat too much, get regular exercise, all of those consistent messages that come through from healthcare charities and organizations. They give you the best possible chance of feeling mentally well. And we know that a lot of people who don't eat particularly well or follow a bad diet, they're more at risk of having issues with their mental health, because it's all about nutrient status as well. So if you're getting all the nutrients that you need, you'll give your body the best possible chance. If you avoid certain nutrients for whatever reason, whether you don't want carbs or you don't want fat or you don't want sugar, you miss out some of the essential things that are involved in those food groups, and that can affect your mental health as well. So there isn't really sort of a mood boosting food, but a healthy, balanced mood boosting diet is probably the best approach to take if you look at the big picture. It's the same kind of principle of there's no magic individual food that will lower your blood pressure significantly. You need to look at your whole approach to things, as well as reducing your salt, reduce your weight overall. So big picture rather than individual foods. I'm having a look through the questions now just to kind of see if there's anything we can deal with in the next few minutes. But guys, did you, either of you guys have anything that you wanted to add that we've not kind of spoken about before we close in the next 5 minutes or so?
No, I don't think so.
I think I think the sort of notion of self-compassion really and kindness is something that just keeps cropping up with me when I talk to people about how they're living with themselves at the moment and how they're managing their lives at the moment, is to kind of live with the uncertainty of it all a bit more and allow that uncertainty to just be there and not expect things to be brilliant or great, and just accept something about the tolerance of boredom, isn't it? The tolerance of fear, the tolerance of uncertainty, the tolerance of difference, I guess. And it, you know, it's all cliched stuff, isn't it? I don't need to be an expert to say it, but you know, time helps and things get better and it will pass, and all those cliches are also all true. And sometimes just accepting that this is just a short period in our lives and that it will be over. And I know that is a real cliche, but if you can hold that and accept that things are just going to be a little bit different and a bit rubbish for a while, then maybe it does make it easier for you to be kind to yourself, really.
Yeah, and with those coping mechanisms, you know, we've had a tip that I think is really important from someone called Ruth about mindfulness. So I was very, very cynical about mindfulness when I first got told about it, and I didn't want to do it. And then I started doing it, and it actually made a huge difference on the way that I process things and the way that I kind of evaluated my day. And it's been really helpful. So Ruth, I do think that mindfulness is helpful. I think it's a really great tool once you get used to it. It's doesn't come naturally to everybody. I think that for me, it took about a month before I got into it. But then now I find myself through the day practicing different mindfulness techniques when I'm under stress or pressure, and it's become really helpful. So I definitely agree with that. We've got another comment here, Jane. I know you love these types of things for your studies, but they've said in the late 80s, plates appear to be more generically white with no patterns. Do you think that larger plates, and especially if the plates look very attractive, are they making us eat more food? Is there something in the visual representation of how something is that would make us do that?
Yeah, there is a whole load of literature on that, both in terms of, you know, even just how much wine we drink, from the size of the glass to the size of the plate. And the desire to empty your plate, really. So I think there's several things going on. I mean, one is that a big plate with small amounts of food on it makes us feel that something's missing, and that can then make us want to eat more afterwards. And a big plate with lots on it can make it feel like it's satisfying. But we also just need to finish what's in front of us. So, you know, there's definitely a kind of, you know, post-war rationing mentality that I was certainly brought up on, which was about not wasting food. So we will eat what is there, and then we will feel deprived if what is there looks smaller. And there are visual ways of making it look smaller than it actually is. So I think all those processing cues are important.
Absolutely. I've actually remembered this time that I will run a poll. I want to check, you guys, so your level of knowledge, now that we've actually gone through all of our questions that we wanted to discuss, and hopefully some of the ones that you've posed to us as well. We'd just like to know that, you know, is this webinar helpful? Have we made you more knowledgeable? You know, do you understand a lot more? Obviously, I don't want to reduce Francis and Jane's experiences down to 45 minutes, but encapsulated within that, I hope that we've been able to help. And the poll says yes, my goodness. So we've now got more than 95% of people have said they're knowledgeable or very knowledgeable. So that's fantastic. That's really good for us. Guys, I'll let you keep voting on the poll while I just say thank you so much for joining us. We do record all of our webinars, so if you've missed part of this for some reason, we aim to upload it on our website within about a week or so that you can watch it again if you've missed something or if you've missed parts of it. All of our webinars are completely free, so we would love to keep it that way, and if you are kind enough to want to make a donation to us, that would be fantastic. We've had some really wonderful donations from people over the webinar series the past few months, so thank you to all those people who've already donated, and those who are new who continue to do so. And thank you to Jane and Francis, who joined us in their own time tonight to talk about diets and psychology, and hopefully I can convince them to do some more stuff with us soon, which would be good.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. I'll end the poll in there, and I've come out at 96% of people are now knowledgeable or very knowledgeable. So I think
amazing.
We can take that as a great success. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you at another public webinar very, very soon.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.